So we have got there, guys. We've made it to the very end of the F123 calendar and can now say that we have an optimised dry car setup for every single track in the game. Here I've put together every single setup that I created in one tidy video. So for those who don't fancy jumping around and watching all of our individual setup videos, here is the one place where every single dry car setup can live. Now this is a bit of a monster video, coming in at close to an hour and a half long, but don't fear, I'll put handy timestamps in the description below so you can quickly jump between car setups for the tracks you need. And if any of these car setups have helped you out, please consider subscribing, as that will go a long way towards helping our channel grow and letting us reach more people. Also, let me know which track and car setup combination you like the most. But for now, I'll leave you with all of the car setups and I really hope you enjoy them. Yo guys, F123 is now here, and one of the first areas that I like to spend time tinkering with is the car setups. And with Bahrain being the first track on the F1 calendar, I'm going to go ahead and start right there. So just as we did last year, here is our optimal F123 Bahrain car setup. This has been designed to be competitive during races, and it's worth noting that this is not a time trial setup. I mean, it will still be fast, but there can be some adjustments made if you do want to use it for time trials. Instead, this setup is designed for races and longer distance races as well, and it will give you a competitive car during a race along with good tyre wear. Now before I do jump into the setup itself, I just want to say that I'm going to be releasing daily F123 car setup videos, so subscribe if you want to be notified when a new video drops, and also hit that like button if you're enjoying F123 so far. So starting with the aero setup for our Bahrain car setup, I've opted for a front wing aero of 36 and a rear wing aero setup of 35. Now this approach is relatively high downforce, and despite Bahrain being home to a few long straights, you will be able to put in the fastest lap times with a higher downforce setup. This is due to almost the entire track from turn 1 through to the second to last corner requiring a pretty high downforce setup. I've opted for a slightly higher front wing aero setup than the rear just to give a little extra turning, although both front and rear wings remain extremely similar, and this provides good balance between the front and rear of the car. Now, F123 has really gone a long way to improve the feel of driving a Formula 1 car without traction control. It's now much easier to apply the throttle without spinning your rear wheels in this year's game. Despite this, I've still opted for a low on-throttle diff setup. Bahrain has a few heavy traction zones where you'll be accelerating hard from low speed, and it's a track which is notoriously rear limited due to these traction zones. So opting for a low on-throttle diff just ensures that throughout a longer race where tyres are wearing, it's still easy to find traction. I've set up the transmission at 56% for on throttle and 54% off throttle, and this is very similar to our approach in F122. The suspension geometry also follows suit from our F122 setup, with this setup's camber and toe almost being identical to last year's game. Go all the way right on the camber for both front and rear, and then reduce the front toe all the way and set the rear toe at 0.12. This approach will give you the best speed throughout a lap without too much penalty to tyre wear. The suspension setup is one area of car setups that's rather different in this year's game. There are now much more options to choose from when configuring the suspension, the anti-roll bar and ride height. There are 41 options for both front and rear suspension, 21 for the anti-roll bars and 20 for the ride height. For this F123 Bahrain car setup, I've softened everything down from the default setup. Go with 15 on the front suspension and 10 on the rear, and then opt for 9 on the front anti-roll bars and just 1 on the rear. Finally, set the ride height almost slap bang in the middle at 37 in the front and 40 in the rear. A softer suspension is beneficial around Bahrain in F123, but it'll be interesting to see if this trend continues for other tracks in this year's game. Now the way brake bias setups has also changed in F123, meaning you won't be able to run 50% brake bias anymore. Instead, I've opted for a brake bias of 57%. This is to really eliminate any rear locking which can happen during a race if you brake a little too hard or a little too late. It is hard for you to lock your front wheels in this year's game, so you can get away with a brake bias set to 57%, but this is a little bit on the high side. Then keep the brake pressure at 100% for the best braking efficiency. Finally, the tyre setup is on the low side for Bahrain. I've lowered the front pressures to 22.9 psi on the front right and 22.6 on the front left. Now the reason that the left pressure is lower than the right is that the tyre that wears the fastest throughout a race is the left front, so this is just designed to protect it a little bit. And then for the rear tyre pressures, I've gone with 20.2 psi on both right and left rear tyres. You can run the tyres hotter in F1 23 compared to last year's game, with the optimal temperature sitting around 100 degrees. Yo guys, next up on the calendar and next to receive our car setup treatment is Jeddah. Now this is a fast and frantic circuit where corners just don't seem to stop coming at you. In F1 23, Jeddah is particularly tricky due to its high reliance on a low drag setup for the long straights and sheer mechanical grip and downforce through the fast and furious corners. This car setup is hugely successful and results in an absolute rocket ship of a car. So if you enjoy this setup or if you liked our Bahrain car setup, let me know in the comments. Also, subscribe to be the first to see when we drop a new F1 23 car setup video. Now, jumping into the setup itself, as I mentioned, this car setup results in a car that is mightily fast around the entire Jeddah circuit. I've opted for a relatively low downforce approach, and this results in being able to easily keep up with and simply drive past the AI along the straights. I've gone for a higher front wing aero setup compared to the rear at 22, and this is designed to help the front of the car generate the downforce needed to be able to throw your car into the fast corners. The rear wing aero is set to 20, which ensures that the rear of the car can keep up with the front, and it makes sure that it sticks to the road through the fast direction changes and crucially when accelerating hard out of turn 13. For the differential, I've kept things low, which just ensures that the rear traction isn't an issue. With a relatively low rear aero setup, you could run into a few issues finding traction if you do run your on-throttle diff too high, so I've opted for the lowest of low setup choices and gone with an on-throttle diff setup of just 50%. Then to promote front turning, particularly through the slower corners such as turn 1 and turn 27, I set the off-throttle diff to 53%. The suspension geometry can be set to our usual approach of almost far right on the camber and almost far left on the toe. I've set the front camber to -2.5 and the rear camber to -1.1. Then I've gone and set the front toe to 0.01 and the rear toe to 0.13. Tyre wear isn't too much of an issue with this setup, even when I tested it in a full distance race, so you could even be a little bit more aggressive on the geometry setup if you do prefer. Now the trend with F1 23 car setup seems to be a stiffer front and softer rear suspension. This gives good responsiveness while ensuring the rear of the car remains compliant. While our last car setup at Bahrain softened everything right down, I've actually kept the front of the car pretty stiff this time round. The curbs around Jeddah can be a little harsh, especially the curb after turn 10, so if you do struggle a little bit over the curbs during a race, feel free to soften the front of the car a little bit more. It will just sacrifice a little bit of responsiveness. I've opted for a front suspension of 29 and a rear setup of 6. Then go for front anti-roll bars set to 14 and rear right down at just 2. Then for the ride height, I've opted for a front ride height setup of 35, while the rear remains at 39. Now I really like how brakes feel in F1 23, with the sensation of rear locking being much more realistic. Not running brake bias at 50% really satisfies my inner desire for a realistic F1 sim. For this setup, and for almost all of my F1 23 car setups, I'm running the brake pressure at 100%, and I've gone for a brake bias of 56%, which seems to be around the sweet spot this year. The last part of our Saudi Arabian car setup are the tyre pressures. I've set the front pressures higher than the rear to enable a bit more initial responsiveness. Go for 22.9 psi on the front right and 23 on the front left. Then for the rear pressures, set them to 20.3 psi on the rear right and 20.5 on the rear left. The offset between left and right tyres is designed to preserve the side of the car that takes the most punishment, which around Jeddah is both of the tyres on the right hand side of the car. And that will complete our F1 23 Jeddah car setup. The next track on the F1 23 calendar after Jeddah is Australia, and boy, this is an extremely fun circuit to drive. It's been a staple on the F1 calendar for years now, but it saw a relatively big change to the layout last year. The track itself remains fast with a good number of medium to high speed corners and long straights that make for great overtaking in F123. Now, my previous car setup for Jeddah was without a doubt one of my favourites, with extremely high performance. But this Melbourne car setup makes racing around Australia throughout a full race immensely fun and enjoyable. The removal of the chicane along the back straight made the Australian track much faster, putting much more emphasis on a lower downforce aero setup. Before this chicane was removed, you used to be able to run higher downforce, although in F123, you'll still want the downforce levels to be around the middle ground. I've set the front wing aero to 30 and lowered the rear wing aero to 26, and this is about as high as you'd ever want to run unless it's wet or unless you're going for a time trial setup, which this certainly isn't. If you're towards the back of the pack, you may even want to lower the aero levels 1 or 2 points just to make overtaking a little bit easier. Now, the differential setup around Australia in F123 is pretty tricky. There are many corners that would benefit from higher on-throttle diff settings, although the slower corners really require a low on-throttle diff. Turns 13 and 14 in particular, the last 2 corners on the track, really test your ability to lay down the power without spinning your rear wheels. To counter this and make it easier to maintain traction, I've opted for an on-throttle diff setup of 53% and an off-throttle setup of 52%. The suspension geometry around Melbourne is pretty standard with a couple of minor adjustments here and there. I've gone from minus 2.6 degrees on the front camber and minus 1 on the rear. Then I've opted for a front toe out setup of 0.03 and rear toe in of 0.12. Melbourne is relatively low to average on the amount of punishment your tyres receive, so this style of setup can be more catered towards performance rather than preserving tyre life. The suspension setup itself is on the softer side compared to some others. This will allow you to attack corners with higher curbs, which tend to be quite a lot of the corners around Melbourne. Set your front suspension to 23 and rear suspension to just 3, and then set your anti-roll bars to 6 and 1, and finally set your ride height to 34 and 37. Any lower than this and riding over the curbs around this track will become a little bit dicey. The brake setup is standard at 100% brake pressure and 55% brake bias. When in doubt, just run this setup at most tracks. I have seen some setups running a 50% brake bias like in F122, and this approach can work well for time trial, but in a realistic race scenario, a 50% brake bias almost guarantees a spin during heavier braking zones. Finally, the tyre pressures for our Melbourne setup are pretty individualised. I've tailored each tyre pressure to really try to ensure the tyres wear evenly without affecting performance too much. Set the front right tyre pressure to 22.6 psi and the front left to 22.7, and then set the rear right to just 20.1 psi and the rear left to 20.3. This low tyre pressure approach will ensure you maintain good traction around the slower corners and help rear tyre life. When testing this setup in a longer distance race, I could easily pit later than the AI around me. Yo guys, Baku is the next track on the F123 calendar after Australia, and it presents a completely different challenge. Baku's a technical street circuit which mixes extremely slow corners, typical of a street circuit, with an extremely long straight. This combination presents some problems when creating a car setup and means that any setup that we create will essentially be a compromise between top speed and downforce. In F123, Baku feels pretty different to previous games. The track seems to have been adjusted and now a lot more precision is needed, and the braking zones are slightly longer. This means our car setup needs to be on point, and this was certainly not an easy car setup to create. But here is our F123 Baku car setup, which has been designed for long distance races. Now, Baku's a really unique track when it comes to our aero setup. It shares a lot of similarities with Singapore with all of the 90-degree left and right turns, and these typically require an extremely high downforce setup. However, that long pitch straight, which is one of the longest in F1, means that if you do run a high downforce setup, you'll lose a ton of time down this straight. For this reason alone, we need to prioritize a low downforce setup. Now, the setup I've gone for is 13 for the front wing aero and 12 for the rear. Rear downforce is important at this track as you'll be constantly fighting for traction and grip. However, it's even more important to have a responsive car that's happy to turn into those 90-degree corners with ease, and this setup achieves this goal. As I just mentioned, rear traction is a problem around Baku. This track is extremely rear limited, meaning your rear tyres will wear a lot quicker than your fronts. One of the best ways to combat this and ensure you have good traction is by setting our on-throttle differential setup to 50. And that's exactly what I've done. Almost. I've actually opted for an on-throttle diff setup of 51 and an off-throttle diff setup of 50. Now I focused the suspension geometry setup on performance over tyre life. While it is important to ensure your tyres last as long as possible, any other suspension geometry apart from this one simply made the car not have the mechanical grip needed mid-corner. Go with -2.5 on the front camber and -1.2 on the rear, and then lower the front and rear toe all the way to their minimum values. Your front tyres can struggle to be brought up to temperature around Baku, so setting a pretty aggressive geometry setup can actually help with this a little bit. Now, the suspension setup did cause me some problems. A stiff suspension would be ideal to increase responsiveness, however the sheer number of large curbs mean that running a stiff suspension setup can cause all sorts of issues during a race. If you hit any of the curbs with an overly stiff suspension, you'll be having an early dinner date with the wall. Now I've softened the suspension down to 20 at the front and 8 at the rear. This provides an easier car to drive, which will allow you to be consistent throughout a longer race. Then set the anti-roll bars to 8 at the front and just 1 at the rear. You can lower the ride height right down, which is kind of unusual for a street circuit, but luckily Baku is quite flat, so you can get away with 32 at the front and 33 at the rear. This suspension setup is really designed for stability and making sure that the car is as easy to drive as possible. Now for the brakes, go with our usual approach with 100% brake pressure and 56% brake bias. Rear locking can really be an issue at some of the corners around Baku, so you can move the brake bias a little further forward than our usual 55%. Then the tyre pressures are fairly high at the front for an F123 setup and very low at the rear, and the reason for this is due to all of the slow corners. Heating your front tyres can be a problem, but all of the high traction zones mean you can easily overheat your rears. Go for 23 psi for both front tyres and then 20.2 psi on the rear right and 20.3 on the rear left. Our next car setup is for Miami, and this is one of the newer circuits to the F1 calendar, but it's a street track with a bit of a difference. The design of the circuit is much like that of Jeddah, with fast and flowing sectors, long straights and a few incredibly slow corners. And much like our Jeddah car setup, this combination of almost every type of track element means that our car setup will be a compromise. This track, however, is one that I really enjoy racing around, and this car setup creates a car which is stable enough to throw around with confidence and consistency. There's an extremely long straight and another really long curve at this Miami circuit, both of which require a low downforce setup. To be competitive during a race, you need to set your aero pretty low, otherwise you'll struggle down the long straights. However, this aero setup really is a balance because there are a few fast corners where your car can step out on you if you don't have enough downforce. In particular, turn 3 and turn 18, which are both flat right-handers, can cause the rear of your car to oversteer. To counteract this, I've gone for an aero setup with a slightly higher rear wing than front. Go with 16 at the front wing and 17 at the rear. This approach creates a setup with much lower aero than most time trial setups, but this really pays off during a race when overtaking is much easier. For the differential, I've lowered it down, which is pretty standard for most tracks in F123 so far. Go with 57 on your on-throttle diff and just 52 on your off-throttle diff. The lower off-throttle diff setup really helps the front of your car rotate into slower corners and counters the lower front wing aero setup. Our suspension geometry setup has been tailored to give a good mixture of tyre life and mechanical grip mid-corner. As per usual with our F123 car setups, I've gone far right on the camber with -2.7 at the front and -1 at the rear. Then for the toe, set your front toe to 0.03 and rear toe to 0.2. Higher rear toe helps keep the rear of your car in check through the faster corners that I mentioned earlier and gives you some much needed stability. Our suspension setup for Miami is relatively balanced. I've set the front suspension at the midway point at 22 and lowered the rear suspension to 8. Then I've set the front anti-roll bar to 10 and rear to just 1. Then you can set your ride height to 35 at the front and 38 at the rear. And this is about as low as you want to go, and you should really try to avoid riding up onto the exit curb after turn 5, otherwise you'll easily bottom out and completely be out of shape for the left-handers of turn 6 and 7. For the brake setup, I've maxed out the brake pressure at 100% and set the brake bias to 56%. You can move this a little more rearward if you struggle with locking up into the really slow section of track, but at 56% I found it just right. For our tyre setup, I've set the front pressures higher than the rears once again. Go 22.9 and 23 on your front tyre pressures and 20.4 and 20.5 on your rear pressures. The lower rear tyre pressures are designed to protect the rear tyres from wearing too fast, as this will be the limiting factor during a race. Imola is one of the classic circuits in F1 23, and it's a track that features a really fast and intense layout. There are a combination of fast and technical corners, with the tricky turns 11 and 12 really testing the driver's skill. Any Imola car setup has to result in a car which is stable through direction change and light on its toes. This approach will reward a driver with a fast and nimble car that will perform well during a race. Now, despite featuring fast corner sequences, we don't need to run an extremely low aero setup around Imola. There aren't too many long straights like you'll find at other low downforce tracks such as Monza and Spa, and this means that we can set our aero setup on the higher side. I've gone for a front wing setup of 30 and a rear wing setup of 28. This provides a good amount of responsiveness which is required when you throw your car left and right through the fast chicanes. For the transmission setup, we'll follow the general rule of most F1 23 setups with a low on-throttle and off-throttle diff. Go for 57 on the on-throttle and 51 for the off-throttle diff setup. Setting the on-throttle diff higher than our normal 55% allows the rear wheels to push you through the faster corners a bit better, maintaining a higher minimum corner speed. But it's still low enough to provide good traction out of the slower corners such as turns 7 and 15. Our suspension geometry setup for Imola is very normal of any F1 23 setup, with camber to the far right and toe to the far left, although I haven't set the geometry to the very extremes. Instead, go with -2.7 and -1 for the camber, and 0.02 and 0.13 for the toe. We can get away with this approach as we don't need to worry too much about minimising drag from our toe setup, so we can increase both toe values a little for added responsiveness and stability. Go with 24 on the front suspension and 7 on the rear, then go for 8 on the front anti-roll bar and 2 on the rear. This is a pretty normal setup for F1 23 and keeps the car on its toes, yet it's still soft enough to handle the curbs throughout a lap. For the ride height, we can go a little lower around Imola than at some tracks. Go for 33 in the front and 36 on the rear. Now, I've set the brake pressure to 100% and the brake bias to 55%, and this is our normal approach which prevents both front and rear locking and results in a pretty balanced brake setup. For the tyre setup, to round out our Imola car setup, go with 22.7 on both fronts and 20.3 on both rears. The increased front tyre pressures help with a little extra responsiveness, which is kind of the theme of this car setup, while the lower pressures help with both traction and preserving tyre wear. Now, Monaco is a track in F1 23 that many dislike, and I can firmly say that I'm part of that group. It's a super tight and twisty circuit, and the rules are always there ready to eat up anyone who makes a mistake. However, on the brighter side, in F1 23, Monaco is actually much easier to drive than it was in previous years, thanks to the refinements that have been made to the driving physics. And when the car's easier to drive, the walls and the skinny track suddenly aren't as much of an issue. So I am approaching this Monaco setup with a lot more enthusiasm than I have done in previous years. Now, I won't go as far as saying I actually like this track, but I'm going to try and have as much fun as I can. While the driving physics have been improved a lot, the aerodynamic setup still needs to follow our normal approach for Monaco. Set the front wing aero to its maximum value at 50 and the rear wing close to maximum at 48. This track requires the most amount of downforce possible, and that starts with the aero setup. Now, the reason I haven't set the rear wing to 50 is to actually allow some opportunity of overtaking, which is actually possible this year. For the transmission, we need to simply make the car as easy to drive as possible, and that means setting the on-throttle differential to 50% and the off-throttle diff to 53%. This approach makes traction as easy as possible to come by, making the car easier to drive at slower speeds. Now, we don't need to worry about straight line speed too much, and that's reflected in our geometry setup. You can see we're running the usual camber setup of far right for both front and rear, but we also have high toe settings as well. This will increase both responsiveness and stability at the expense of straight line performance. But that's a trade-off that we can happily make around Monaco. For the suspension, you ideally want it pretty soft so it can handle the bumps and curves that are typical of this tight and twisty street circuit. Don't soften everything too far though, otherwise your car will start to feel a bit like jelly and will simply be too slow. Go for 12 and 7 on the suspension setup and 7 and 2 for the anti-roll bars. Then raise the ride height to cope with the undulations around Monaco and opt for 36 and 42. Now, I did contemplate lowering the brake pressure around Monaco, as there are a few places where lockups are pretty common. However, I found it more efficient keeping the brake pressure at 100% and simply modulating the brake input that I apply. This is most important on the approach to turn 18, where lockups are extremely common. Then go ahead and set your brake bias to 54%. Tyre temperatures can really be an issue around Monaco, purely because of the heavy traction requirements when accelerating out of slow speed corners. For this reason, lower all pressures to 22.2 at the front and just 20 psi at the rear. And that will complete our Monaco car setup for F1 23. The circuit de Catalunya is really quite a balanced track, but it's seen a bit of an overhaul over the past few years. Last year saw a remodelling of turn 10 to make it faster, and this year sees the removal of the tight and twisty and really rather annoying chicane that was towards the end of the lap. By removing this slow chicane, the whole track's become faster overall, and this does actually change our setup approach from previous years. Our aerodynamic setup for Spain in F1 23 is still pretty high. This is due to the really technical corners through the start and the middle part of the lap. Set the front wing aero to 36 and the rear to 34. It's important to ensure that you have a really stable car around Spain, so you don't want the rear wing to be too low or too much lower than the front. A lot of pressure is put on the rear of the car while accelerating through the longer corners, including the new fast turn 14. For the transmission setup, I've opted for 50% on throttle diff and 55% off throttle. This will ensure we don't work the rear tyres too hard, as the tyres can really be punished around this track. There are also some key acceleration zones where traction is really important, so this approach addresses that. The suspension geometry is really set up to provide good mechanical grip throughout the wide variety of corners. And the best way of doing this is with your camber set far right and the toe close to far left. Although this year I've increased the rear toe a bit to help maintain stability through some of those faster corners. For the suspension, opt for a stiffer front end to help with direction change, so go with 28 at the front and 7 at the rear, and then go with an anti-roll bar setup of 7 and 2, and your ride height to be relatively balanced at 36 and 40. For the brake setup, you can set your brake pressure a little further rearwards, as there aren't too many really heavy braking zones. Instead, the shorter and sharper braking zones do benefit more from a more neutral brake balance. Go with 100% brake pressure like normal and a brake bias of 53%. Now, as I mentioned earlier, tyre wear can be an issue around Spain, and one of the better ways to manage it is by lowering the pressures. This will really reduce the temperature build-up and lower the overall tyre wear. It also softens the car a little bit too. Go 22.5 psi on both front tyres, and then opt for 20.2 and 20.1 on the rear tyre pressures. The lower rear left pressure helps to mitigate wear on the most vulnerable tyre. Canada in F1 23 is a track that is right up there with my most enjoyable circuits. It's fast and flowing with a really good combination of mid to high speed corners and long straights. This track can lead to some of the more enjoyable races due to the ease of overtaking thanks to those long straights, combined with a constant danger of those walls being pretty close by. This track really requires good consistency levels, especially when throwing your car through the fast right-left chicanes at high speed, because any misplacement will either lose you time or throw you off track. Now, our aero setup really prioritises the rear of the car. While good front end responsiveness is important, it's absolutely vital to ensure you have a car that sticks to the road when accelerating out of the fast chicanes. If you have a slightly rear loose end, you'll really struggle to get the power down out of these corners, and it'll be easy pickings along the straights that follow. Go with 23 at the front of the car and 24 at the rear. This will induce a little bit of understeer, but this is much more manageable than an unpredictable rear end. A transmission setup of 50% for both your on-throttle and off-throttle diff will also target these fast corners. The low on-throttle differential will improve the ease when accelerating out of each corner, helping you apply more throttle sooner. And the low off-throttle differential will help to combat some of the understeer from our aero setup. It allows the car to rotate more on the approach to corners. For the suspension geometry, go with -2.6 and -1 for the camber, and then go with 0.02 and 0.16 for the toe. Again, the rear toe value has been increased to help with rear stability, although this will provide a very minor penalty to a little bit more drag down the long straights. However, our low downforce approach more than compensates for this. For the suspension, run an unusually soft front suspension at just 17 and a soft rear at 14. Then go for 7 and 2 on the anti-roll bars and 33 and 36 for the ride height. This approach will let you ride up and over those rather large curbs that are at the apex of every corner around Canada. This is key to shortening the corners, especially through the fast chicanes. An overly stiff car will almost always result in loss of control over these large curbs. For the brakes, opt for a very usual approach of 100% brake pressure and 54% brake bias. We can get away with a slightly lower brake bias around Canada, as this approach is preferable to faster corners where you don't need to slow down the car as much. Then for the tyres, set the front pressures to 22.6 psi to promote pretty good responsiveness, and set the rear pressures to 20.2 psi, as this will aid traction and help keep the rear of the car planted to the track surface. The Red Bull Ring in Austria is one of the fastest and most flowing circuits in F1 23. There are a good combination of corners from extremely slow, almost hairpin-like turns through to medium speed and fast corners. This diversity really tests your car's overall balance and stability. The rear car stability is a really important factor due to the faster corners, which can cause some problems with rear grip if your car isn't set up properly. But thankfully, this setup doesn't suffer from those problems. Instead, it's fast during a full lap and competitive across a whole race distance. The aerodynamic setup is relatively low due to the extremely long straight right after the pit straight, and there are 3 long straights in total, meaning a high downforce setup just won't work. Go for 19 on the front wing aero and 15 on the rear wing. This provides good front end bite when you throw the car in towards the apex, and not lowering the rear aero too far ensures it can keep up during the faster turns. With the extremely slow turn 3 and rather tricky turn 1, it's no surprise that I've set the on-throttle differential setup to 50%. This will aid with traction through both of these corners, and then set the off-throttle diff to just 51%. Our suspension geometry incorporates the ideology of most F1 23 car setups, with both front and rear camber being set towards the max. So set the front to -2.6 and the rear to -1. Then lower the toe, but not all the way down. Set the front toe to 0.02 and the rear toe to 0.16. And then the suspension setup for the Red Bull Ring is pretty aggressive. I kept the front suspension pretty stiff, and this will allow the front end to be incredibly responsive when you throw your car into the faster corners towards the end of the lap. There also aren't too many high curbs around Austria, so we don't need to soften the car to account for those. Just be careful with turn 1 because the curb there is probably the largest of the whole lap. Then at the rear, go with a suspension setup of 10. For the anti-roll bars, go with 10 and 1, and for the ride height, go with 33 and 39. Then for the brakes, I've gone with our usual route of 100% brake pressure and 54% brake bias. You can increase the brake bias into turn 3 if you want to shorten your braking distance, but ensure it's back to 54% before the next corner. Finally, I've set the tyre pressures all on the lower side, with the fronts higher than the rears. This is very normal for F123, so go with 22.9 on the front tyres and 20.3 on the rear tyres. Now we get to possibly my all-time favourite track in an F1 game, Silverstone. Now I may be slightly biased that this is my home Grand Prix and I've been lucky enough to visit, but Silverstone is both one of the most exciting tracks to watch a Formula 1 race and actually race in F123. The combination of fast corners, slower corners, and that sequence from Maggots through to Chapel really make this track stand out. There are plenty of overtaking spots, and as long as you don't have a car setup with too much downforce, you can really have a strong race in F123. Now I've opted for an aero setup of 26 at the front and 22 at the rear. This ensures your car remains responsive, which is crucial through those sweeping S's. This setup is a little on the lower side compared to some time trial setups. However, during a race, you'll need a lower downforce approach than you do during a time trial session, as this will allow you to defend and overtake easier. The transmission setup is not a surprise if you've seen any of our other F123 car setups. Go with 55% on throttle and 50% off throttle diff. This really is the best approach with almost every F123 car setup. Now for the suspension geometry, things are a little different to most F123 setups. I've gone with a front camber of -2.5, pretty normal, but a rear camber of -1.5. Then I've lowered the toe right down to 0 at the front and 0.12 at the rear. This is designed to optimise the car for the straight parts of the track to minimise drag, as well as really factoring in tyre wear. I've kept the front suspension relatively stiff to ensure we've got good responsiveness, while I've lowered the rear. Go with 28 at the front and 8 at the rear for the suspension. Then go with anti-roll bars of 8 and 1 and a ride height of 33 and 35, which is actually really low for an F123 car setup. But Silverstone is incredibly flat and smooth without many really high curbs, so a low ride height is optimal. The brake setup itself is pretty standard at 100% brake pressure and 56% brake bias, but you can lower the brake bias for some corners, maybe such as the approach to the final chicane if you notice any front wheel locking. Finally, the tyre pressures are also on the low side to help preserve tyre wear. But overall, tyre wear is quite balanced with this car setup, with the fronts and rears both going off at the same time. Go with 23 psi on both front tyres and 20.5 psi on both rear tyres. Hungary is a track in F123 that's deceivingly tricky. You may look at the layout and think it's just like any other permanent track. However, the high number of corners, along with the speed that they come at you, makes this one of the tougher tracks in F123. Many will say that Hungary is similar to Monaco, and that's true in terms of our car setup, with many similarities. Thankfully, the Hungarian track in F123 feels as good as it ever has, with low curbs and a layout that lets you really push your car. Hungary requires an extremely high aero setup, with most of the track being comprised of corners with a very few number of proper straights. High downforce will benefit you more than prioritising straight line speed. Many time trial setups run the front wing at 50 or very close to it, but I've lowered it to 46, and I've also lowered the rear wing to 42. This is designed to give you a small advantage over the AI, who will typically run slightly higher downforce levels. This will allow you to be competitive down the straights and be able to overtake during a race. Now, with the track that's so reliant on downforce through slow to medium speed corners, it's no surprise to see our transmission setup at 50 for both on throttle and off throttle. The low on throttle diff setup will maximise your traction when accelerating out of corners, and the low off-throttle diff will maximise your rotation into slower corners. Being a slower track allows us to set up our geometry to include higher levels of toe. I've set the camber to -2.8 and -1, which is pretty normal. Then I've increased both the front toe out and rear toe in to 0.04 and 0.19. This approach will increase your car's liveliness, but in a good way. It'll become more responsive through the first part of a corner, and the rear toe will help it remain stable. For the suspension setup, I've kept the front of the car relatively stiff to help eliminate understeer, which can be a real killer around Hungary. So set this to 30 and then set your rear suspension at 8. For your anti-roll bars, go with 8 and 1, and then set your ride height to 35 and 36. For the brake setup, I've opted for a normal 100% brake pressure, and I'm also running our normal brake bias approach of 55%. Now I've gone ahead and lowered tyre pressures for a few reasons. The first is to increase traction at the rear of the car, and the second is to reduce tyre temperatures which can build up during a race. Go with 22.5 psi on both front tyres and just 20.1 on both rears. Spa is one of the most well recognised tracks in F1 23, and many sim racers will know it from almost any other sim racing title around, as it features heavily across all forms of motorsport, which does say a lot about this track's heritage and quality. While many tracks in F1 23 have been updated and feel incredibly smooth, Spa still feels incredibly raw and bumpy throughout the whole lap. It's a track that requires a rather aggressive setup approach, although you always need to keep one eye on your tyre wear, as this high-speed circuit can really punish your car. Jumping into the aero setup for Spa, I've gone with a front wing aero of 15 and a rear wing aero of just 11. This approach really prioritises the front of the car to make it as responsive as we can within the limitations of the aero we have to play with. These limitations stop us from increasing the aero too far, otherwise we'll be incredibly slow along the faster, straighter segments of track. With a track that is so fast, you may be surprised to see me set the on-throttle diff to just 52%. Now this is designed to help keep rear tyre temperatures low, as well as maximising your traction out of the slower corners. For the off-throttle diff setup, go with just 50%, as this will increase your rotation into the final chicane, as well as a few other corners around the track. Due to the high-speed nature of Spa, I've opted for a very F1 22-esque geometry setup. Go with -2.7 and -1 on the camber, and then just 0.01 and 0.1 on the toe. This will really prioritise the high-speed segments of track. Typically, around Spa in F1 23 you'll want a stiff suspension. This will give you the best responsiveness, which is as important as ever around this track. However, you will be riding up and over a lot of curbs, and you'll also want to keep an eye on your tyre temperatures. A stiffer suspension can negatively affect both of these areas, so I've softened it down a little bit away from what could be a really aggressive setup. Go with just 31 on the front suspension and 10 on the rear, and then go with 10 and 3 on the anti-roll bars. For the ride height, I've opted for a slightly higher approach than many time trial setups, and this is to account for those large bumps throughout the track. A slightly increased ride height won't affect your straight line speed or downforce too much, but it will result in a vastly better ride quality, so go with 35 and 38. For the brakes, I've gone with our normal approach of 100% brake pressure and 55% brake bias, and then the tyre pressures are higher at Spa than I've used at other tracks so far. This will promote extra responsiveness and keep the tyres in their working window of around 95 to 105 degrees. Go with 23.6 psi and 23.5 psi on the front pressures, then opt for 20.8 psi on both rears. In F1 23, Zandvoort feels almost like a completely different track compared to last year. Codemasters have made a lot of improvements to this track's realism, and this really impacts how you approach this circuit. Zandvoort is an inherently tricky track to master, kind of due to its unusual layout, but also due to its strange braking zones. But the wider track in F1 23 really helps you carry some additional speed through some turns, and some corners such as the reprofiled turn 2 are much more enjoyable. That doesn't make this track easy to master by any means, with precision and stability still really required to get the fastest lap times. Now Zandvoort's another track that does benefit from a higher aero setup, much like Hungary. The corners themselves aren't too slow, with a good mixture of slow to medium and a few high-speed corners. However, the sheer number of corners puts a heavy reliance on high downforce levels. Go with 45 on the front wing and just 36 on the rear. Now this is possibly the largest gap between front and rear wings that I've run in a car setup so far in F1 23. However, the need for front end grip results in a much higher front wing aero setup. Much like our other high downforce car setups such as Hungary and Monaco, go with 50% on throttle differential to aid with rear traction, and then go with 51% off throttle. For the suspension geometry, I've opted for maximum levels of camber at -2.5 and -1, although technically this is the minimum amount of camber, but that's F1 23's strange camber labelling right there. Then go with high levels of toe with 0.06 at the front and 0.25 at the rear. The main thing we need here is high rear toe to aid with extra stability. This is important through the faster corners, as well as mitigating some of the rear downforce loss that comes from the low rear wing angle. I've opted for a stiff front suspension to aid responsiveness and a soft rear suspension to ensure the car remains compliant. Go with 36 and 9 on your suspension setup, then go with 10 and 5 on your ARBs, and finally go with the ride height setup of 36 and 40. For the brake setup, I've opted for 100% brake pressure, then I have lowered the brake bias to 53%. This rearward brake bias is beneficial through the corners where you're turning whilst braking at the same time, as it prevents understeer. However, if you find the rear of your car becoming unstable under braking at certain points of the lap, you can safely increase it to 54 or even 55% if needed. You really want to manage tyre temperatures around Zandvoort, as the temperatures and wear can build up through the fast segments of track. Go with 22.7 psi for both front tyres, then lower the rears to 20.3 and 20.1 psi. This is designed to target the rear tyres and in particular the rear left tyre, which will be the tyre that wears the fastest throughout a race. Coming off the back of Zandvoort, which saw a huge overhaul in F1 23, Monza in Italy is another track which feels much better to drive in this year's game. Corners such as the first chicane have been updated to feel slightly wider, allowing for an easier approach. However, Monza still remains one of the harder tracks to actually create a car setup for. It's a track that really rewards a low downforce car, however this approach will hurt through some of the faster corners. So finding a good Monza car setup is especially important, as your setup direction can lead you to lose or gain a lot of time at different points of the track. Monza requires one of the lowest downforce car setups of any track in F1 23. Go with just 5 on the front wing aero and 7 on the rear. This approach is really required to be competitive down those long straights, but it will result in some understeer in places, especially through the final corner. Thankfully, one of the areas of F1 23 that has improved drastically is traction, and this is felt a lot more around Monza than some other tracks. Exiting corners such as the slow turn 2 are so much easier this year, although it's still advised to adjust your on-throttle diff to help make accelerating as painless as possible. I'd still advise to go for an on-throttle diff setup of almost 50%, and I've gone with 52% here. This will give you kind of the best chance of not spinning your rear wheels, making for the best exit out of the slow corners just before those long straights, which is vitally important to make sure you have good straight line speed. Then set the off-throttle diff to 50%. For the geometry, I've opted for the most classic F1 22 approach with right, left on the camber and toe. This is the only setup we can really run at Monza, as it prioritises straight line speed as much as possible. For the suspension, go with a stiff front suspension of 32 and a softer rear at 12. Then I've opted for a stiffer than normal front anti-roll bar of 13, combined with a super soft rear anti-roll bar of just 1. This may look pretty extreme, but really works to help reduce understeer mid-corner. For the ride height, lower things down to 33 at the front and 36 at the rear. And then I've gone with a brake pressure setup of 100%, and I've increased the brake bias from our normal approach to 56%. Braking efficiency is a key area around Monza, and a more frontward brake bias will help reduce braking zones. You could even increase it to 57% if you want a slightly more extreme brake setup. Now the tyre pressure setup is really tricky about Monza. Tyre wear is incredibly high, but reducing tyre pressures won't help too much, as a lot of the wear isn't necessarily due to excess heat. The long straights go a long way to decrease tyre temperatures between corners. This means to keep tyres warm at the end of the straights, a slightly higher tyre pressure setup is required. Opt for 24.2 and 24.1 psi on the front tyres, then go with 21.5 and 21.4 psi on the rear tyres. Singapore has always been a tricky circuit, although it probably feels at its best in F1 23. This track is extremely fast for such a tight and twisty street circuit, but much like Monaco or even Jeddah, it can be incredibly costly if you make a mistake. A high downforce approach is key to this car setup being successful throughout a full race distance, be that in my team or an online league race. But you must keep one eye firmly on your tyre temperatures because the rears do have a tendency to overheat, which I've tried to address in this car setup. Like other tight and twisty circuits such as Monaco or Hungary, an extremely high aero setup is the best choice. I've opted for a front wing aero of 50 and a rear wing aero of 48. Marina Bay is comprised of a ton of slow to medium speed 90-degree left and right turns, and the fastest way through the majority of these corners is to have close to maximum aero. I've reduced the rear by a couple of points just to ensure you have enough straight line speed to be able to manage overtakes during the race, as there are a few opportunities to do so around a lap of Singapore. It's no surprise that at such a tight and slow speed track, I have set up our on-throttle diff to just 50%. This will help maximise traction, which is ever so important around Singapore. I've then set the off-throttle diff to 54%. The reason I haven't lowered this to 50 is because that approach introduces a little too much rotation at slower speeds. Our suspension geometry setup can be a little bit more adventurous due to the slow speed nature of Singapore. I've gone with a -2.7 and -1 on the camber, front and rear. Then I've kept some toe in the car with a front toe out setup of 0.04 and rear toe in setup of 0.16. The suspension setup for Singapore is tricky, partly because of the high curbs around this track. Ideally, you'd want to soften your suspension to make these curbs much more manageable. However, that will result in a car that's just too slow to turn into the corners, which will lose you a ton of lap time. Instead, I've opted for a front suspension on the stiffer side at 26, with the rear suspension set to 8. With this approach, it's best advised to not ride right up and onto the curbs, as this will almost always cause an instability. Instead, the perfect placement is to just clip most of the curbs with your inside tyre. Then go with an anti-roll bar setup of 7 and 2, and a ride height of 33 and 36. For the brake setup, I've gone with 100% brake pressure as normal. Then I've lowered the brake bias to 54%. This is slightly beneficial into some of the slower corners, as a more frontward brake bias can introduce a tendency for the front wheels to lock at slower speeds. Finally, the tyre pressures are set incredibly low for this car setup. I've gone with 22.5 on both front tyres, and then I've reduced the rear tyre pressures right down to their minimum value of just 20 psi. With all of the heavy traction zones and constant acceleration from slow speeds, your rear tyres will overheat, so the low tyre pressures at the rear of the car really helps to combat this. Suzuka feels as good in F1 23 as it has in any Formula 1 game to date. It's easily one of the most flowing circuits with a real technical edge. Car placement is everything around this track, as many corners lead directly into one another. This means that if you stray away from the racing line into one corner, you'll almost certainly lose time into the next turn. So a good stable car setup that allows for perfect placement lap after lap will really reward you with consistent lap times throughout a race. While the flowing corners are the area where your driving can gain or lose you the most amount of lap time, you do need to account for the long straights around Suzuka, particularly the extremely long back straight right before 130R. This means we can't set our aero setup too high, so I've gone with a front wing aero of 31 and a rear wing aero setup of 28. Front end grip is ever so important around Suzuka, so a higher front wing will benefit more than a higher rear wing setup. As is the trend with the majority of F123 car setups, a 50% on-throttle diff setup is the best approach around Suzuka. It allows you to easily get the power down out of slower corners such as that hairpin and the final chicane. Then go with an off-throttle setup of 52% to help rotate the car, especially into that slow hairpin, which is often the place where you can understeer the most. With the track being pretty fast, I've set our suspension geometry along the lines of other high-speed car setups. Go with -2.6 on the front camber and -1 on the rear. Then set the front toe to 0.01 and the rear toe to 0.1. For the suspension setup around Suzuka, go with 28 on the front suspension and 10 on the rear. This approach is fairly common throughout many F123 car setups and for good reason. It ensures you reduce understeer by having a stiffer front of the car, and the softer rear allows the car to remain compliant without oversteering too much. For the anti-roll bars, go with 6 on the front and 3 on the rear, and then set the ride height to 34 and 37. Now I've gone for a brake pressure setup of 100% and a brake bias right in the sweet spot for F123 at 55%. And then I've increased the tyre pressures at the front of the car to 23.3 psi. Now despite the long corners putting a lot of load on your outside front tyre, you can get away with a higher tyre pressure at the front as the tyres do have a chance to cool down along the straights. For the rear pressures, I've gone with 20.5 psi, which is about normal for an F123 tyre setup. Qatar in F123 is one of the more enjoyable circuits to drive in the whole game. It features a really unusual layout with many corners requiring very little to no braking or downshifting. There are only really a small handful of corners that really slow you down much. The rest of the lap is incredibly fast and flowing, making it extremely fun to drive around. This unusual circuit, I think, will quickly become a fan favourite in F123. Now, Qatar really rewards a higher downforce car setup due to the medium speed nature of almost every corner. Higher downforce will give you much more lateral grip mid-corner, as well as allowing you to carry higher speed on the entry to each turn. And this will ultimately result in much faster overall lap times than opting for a lower downforce approach. Go with 41 on the front wing and 37 on the rear. For the transmission setup, I've opted for 55% on throttle and 52% off throttle. There aren't too many really heavy traction zones, as there are only really 1 or 2 really slow corners. However, you still require good traction capabilities as many of the corners will see you accelerating pretty hard, and early on in the corner as well, while still applying some steering lock. Now for the suspension geometry, I've ripped our setup right out of F122's playbook with a right, left approach, and this helps with traction and straight line speed. For the suspension setup, things are pretty extreme. I've maxed out our suspension stiffness, which will help the front end respond quickly when throwing your car into corners at high speed. Then I've gone for a rear suspension setup of 14, which is still pretty stiff for an F123 car setup. For the anti-roll bars, things are still stiff at 12 and 4, while the ride height is low to medium at 34 and 38. This approach will really help reduce understeer, and with the track being so flat and smooth, we can get away with a really stiff setup approach. I've gone with the brake bias setup that is a touch more rearwards due to the very short braking zones. Go with 54% on the brake bias and 100% on the brake pressure. And for the tyres, I've opted for a slightly higher than normal approach of 22.9 psi in both front tyres and 20.4 psi in both rears. Tyre wear isn't too harsh around the sail, and this relatively normal approach helps keep tyre temperatures right in their working window. The Circuit of the Americas is easily one of my favourite tracks to drive in F123. However, it's also one of my least favourite to create a car setup for. And that's simply because COTA has a little bit of everything. There are long straights combined with fast corners ripped right out of Silverstone or Spa, and then there's a few very slow corners. All of these elements make creating a car setup for COTA in F123 extremely tricky. But once you do get around the setup creation process, this track is mightily fun to drive, partly due to that variety throughout a lap. With this American track featuring so many different qualities from long straights to fast and slow corners, our aero setup will always be a middle ground between all of them. without really specialising in one particular area. I've gone for 38 on the front wing aero and 34 on the rear. This is pretty balanced with a focus on front end turning ability, which is mightily important, especially through the first sweeping sector of the lap. The transmission setup is pretty much as low as we can go. I've set the on-throttle diff to just 52%, which will aid with traction out of slower corners, and it's especially important to get a good launch out of turn 11, which leads onto the long straight. I've then set the off-throttle diff to 50%, which will aid rotation into corners as much as possible. The suspension geometry focuses a lot on reducing understeer, as too much understeer is a real killer around COTA. Go with -2.7 and -1 on the camber, and then opt for 0.04 and 0.12 on the toe. Lowering the rear camber and toe will help with both traction and reducing drag. Much like the rest of our car setup, I've gone for a suspension setup which promotes a really responsive front end. Stiffen the front suspension to 30 while keeping the rear suspension pretty soft at just 8. Then go with 7 and 1 on the anti-roll bars and 34 and 37 on the ride height. For the brakes, opt for 100% brake pressure and then go with a slightly more frontward brake bias of 56%. This will help reduce braking distance, especially into the heavy braking zones such as into turn 1 and turn 12. With so many fast and long corners, tyre wear can be a little bit of an issue. Turns 17 to 19 in particular will put a lot of strain on your tyres, as will those S's in the first sector. So lower all tyre pressures all around with 22.5 psi on both fronts and 20.3 psi on both rears. Mexico is a really tricky track in F1 23, being both hard to drive fast and really master, as well as being tricky to create a car setup for. The mixture of extremely slow 90-degree corners through the first sector, along with the very fast sweeping corners in the middle sector, really test your car's balance in vastly different ways. Any car setup for Mexico will be a compromise, but the goal is to create a car setup which performs as good as possible through each different sector around Mexico. Easier said than done. Okay, so around this track, no matter how much downforce you put into the car, you'll always feel like you haven't got enough. So I've gone and lowered the downforce so that the car is quick and as fast as possible in a straight line, while still keeping just enough in the front and rear aero to be quick through the twistier segments of track. Go with 25 on the front wing and 20 on the rear. With so many slow corners, traction is critical, so make it as easy as possible on yourself and go with 50% on your on-throttle and off-throttle differential. For the suspension geometry, I've opted for a minimal camber and toe setup, and yes, I use minimal in the correct sense of having as little angle as possible in the lean of the wheel, something the codemasters never seem to get right by labelling the lowest amount of camber as the maximum, which I'll still never understand. But go with -2.6 and -1 on your camber setup, and 0 and 0.1 on the toe setup. Now, the suspension setup really focuses on a softer approach. Around Mexico, you'll be riding up and over all of the curbs at almost every corner. During both the slow and fast corners, minimising your corner angle will save you a lot of time. So soften your suspension to 22 at the front and 9 at the rear, then set your anti-roll bars to 7 and 2, and your ride height to 33 and 36. For the brakes, I've opted for 100% brake pressure like normal, and I've carried over our brake bias setup from COTA with a brake bias of 56%. This will help reduce braking distance into the slower corners. Finally, I've increased our tyre pressures a little at the front to 22.9 psi. This will improve the overall responsiveness a touch, and then I've kept the rear pressures low to help with traction at 20.3 psi. Interlagos in Brazil has been a long time favourite track of mine, spanning back many years. It features a rather unusual track layout with many slow to medium speed sweeping corners and a lot of elevation change. Despite the sheer number of slower corners, a higher downforce car setup isn't always the best approach, as a lot of corner speed can be found from just pure mechanical grip alone. This allows some of your aero setup to be targeted more at the long pitch straight where straight line speed is pretty important. So I've gone for an aero setup of 28 at the front and 25 at the rear, which may seem a little low for Brazil. But this keeps our aero setup pretty balanced between straight line speed and pure downforce. This approach will maximise our performance down the long pitch straight and the straight just before turn 4, which really helps with overtaking. But crucially, it also keeps enough downforce in the car to provide good performance throughout all of the corners. Now, many of those corners around Brazil don't feature typical acceleration zones. Instead, many feature gradual acceleration zones where you're still turning through and out of the corner as you're hitting the throttle. This allows us to run an off-throttle differential which isn't completely open. Go with 54% on the on-throttle diff and 52% on the off-throttle diff. For the suspension geometry, I've opted for a pretty traditional approach of minimal camber and toe. Go -2.5 and -1.1 on the camber, and 0 and 0.1 on the toe. For the suspension, I've tried to create stability in the car by not setting anything too stiff, but also keeping enough rigidity in the car through the anti-roll bars to maximise mid-corner speed. Go 26 and 8 on the suspension setup and 6 and 8 on the anti-roll bar setup. Then go and opt for a ride height of 35 and 38. With a fair few corners that feature shorter braking zones, opt for a more rearward brake bias of 53%, and pair that with our normal 100% brake pressure. I've split our front tyre pressures to help reduce wear on the front right, which takes the most punishment around Brazil. Go with 22.8 psi and 22.9 psi on the front tyres, and then opt for 20.3 psi on both rears. F1 23 is the first time we get to see the new Las Vegas track in all of its glory. And it sure is a visual treat to race around this circuit at night. However, that's kind of where the fun stops, as this is a track layout that doesn't do anything for me. It's a pretty standard street track, although it lacks the fluidity of Jeddah and Miami or the technicality of Singapore. And I think it results in a pretty uninspired track layout, which is a real shame. The main focus around Las Vegas and F1 23 is without a doubt straight line speed, with the incredibly long straight that runs right through the Las Vegas Strip. Because of this long straight and other longer straights on the track, you can't run much downforce at all, which will result in the slower corners feeling a little bit clunky. I've set my aero to 10 at the front and 9 at the rear, and this is a good trade-off between adding as much front-end responsiveness and turning as we can get away with, as well as keeping the rear of the car stable through the faster bends. The priority with our transmission car setup is to maximise our traction, enabling for the best corner exit out of the slower corners and onto all of those long straights. This means going with 50% on throttle and off throttle is really our only choice. The low off throttle diff also helps mitigate the low aero setup by improving our rotation into the slow corners. Again, with the track focused almost entirely on straight line speed, a low camber and toe setup is the best approach. Set the camber to -2.5 and -1, and set the toe to 0 and 0.1 to reduce drag as much as possible. The rear camber set to -1 also brings more of the tyre into contact with the track, which does go a bit towards helping traction a little bit. For the suspension, I've opted for a stiffer approach than at most tracks in F1 23. I've gone for 29 and 9 on the suspension setup, which is fairly normal. However, I've then stiffened the anti-roll bars right up to 14 and 11. This will improve our mechanical grip mid-corner by eliminating body roll as much as possible. Finally, set your ride height to 32 and 36. For the brakes, go with the frontward brake bias to help reduce braking distance into the slow corners. So go with 56% bias and 100% pressure. Finally, for the tyres, you'll want to increase the pressures right up. The extremely long straights really allow for the tyres to cool down in between each corner. This allows us to set our tyre pressures high to get the heat into the tyres. Go 24.2 psi on both front tyres and 21.3 psi on both rear tyres. The rear tyres will get much more of a workout compared to the fronts, so they can be much lower. And that will complete our first ever car setup for Las Vegas in a Formula 1 game. So we've made it to the final track on the 2023 Formula 1 calendar already, and it's Abu Dhabi, which has been the last track for many years now. This is a really enjoyable track that has only been improved over the past few years to be even more fun to drive. The improvements or the removal of a couple of chicanes which really help speed the track up and improve its overall flow. And the most recent improvements have really widened some of those corners in the last sector, making them much faster. This also has a big impact on our car setup, with much more of a focus now on straight line performance. Starting with the aero setup, I've opted for a front wing aero of 32 and a rear wing aero of 28. This is still relatively high downforce for a track that features a good number of medium to long straights, and that's purely because the slow to medium corners really require good levels of downforce to maintain higher minimum corner speeds. For the transmission setup, I've opted for a low on-throttle diff of 52% and an extremely low off-throttle diff at just 50%. This will help with traction and car rotation into and out of slower corners, in particular the extremely slow turns 6 and 7. For the suspension geometry, I've opted for the extreme right on the camber, and then I've set the toe to 0.03 and 0.14. This is a really good balance between straight line performance and good mechanical grip through the medium speed turns. For the suspension, you'll want a stiffer front end to help with responsiveness, which is so often the case in F1 23. Opt for 26 here and just 8 on the rear. Then set your anti-roll bars to 7 at the front and 2 at the rear, and finally run a ride height of 34 and 37. As with many of our F1 23 car setup, go with 100% brake pressure and 55% brake bias. If you're ever in doubt over a brake setup, simply go with this approach and it will serve you well at every track. Then for your tyre pressures, go 23.1 psi on both fronts, which is slightly higher than most tracks. This gets them into the correct temperature window as well as helping them last through a longer race distance. Then for the rear pressures, go with 20.4 psi on both left and right rear. One of the best things Codemasters did with F1 23 is to include 3 bonus tracks. China, France and Portugal all found themselves off the official calendar for this year, but all are brilliant circuits in their own right, so it's great to see each one playable in F1 23 from launch. First up in this bunch of bonus tracks is China, and this is a track which has been up there as one of my favourite tracks for over a decade. It features an extremely fun middle sector, combined with a very unusual first corner sequence and one of the longest straights in Formula 1. This unique combination makes the track both enjoyable to drive, but rather tricky to create a car setup for. Do you opt for low downforce to prioritise that huge straight at the expense of downforce through the first and second sector? And how much do you cater your car setup for tyre wear, which due to the sustained corners can be pretty harsh around China? So let's jump into the aero setup and see what approach I took. Now I've gone with an aero setup slap bang in the middle with 28 on the front and just 23 on the rear. This is really designed to target front downforce, while also giving us decent straight line speed. The higher front aero allows the front of the car to stick well through the long corners such as turn 1 and 2, as well as the fast turns 7 and 8. But you will have to watch the rear of your car when exiting turn 12, as it can get a little loose if you accelerate too hard. If this is a real problem, I'd suggest lowering the front aero setup to bring a little bit more balance towards the rear. However, this will cause you to lose a little bit of time through sectors 1 and 2. For the transmission setup, I've opted for a 50-50 approach. I've set both the on-throttle and off-throttle diff to 50%, and this allows you to get the power down without too much trouble from the rear of the car, and the low off-throttle diff really helps rotate the car into turns 6 and 14. For the geometry setup, I've gone with a pretty old school approach of right, left, left, and this puts a big focus on minimising drag and increasing our straight line speed. The suspension setup follows most F1 23 setups with a stiff front of the car and much softer rear. This promotes a pointy front end that will happily turn into corners while the rest of the car remains compliant. Go with 32 and 10 on your suspension setup, then opt for a pretty high front anti-roll bar of 13 and just 3 at the rear. For the ride height, go with 34 and 38. Then for the brake setup, set the pressure to 100% and the brake bias to 56%. You can really get away with a higher brake bias around China due to the heavy braking zones. it may be beneficial to manually lower the brake bias once you exit turn 6 and turn it back up again just before turn 14. Now for the tyre setup, I've gone with a pretty standard setup approach which is slightly on the lower side. Set the front pressures to 22.7 and both rears to 20.3 psi. Now tyre wear is pretty even all around with this approach. The second bonus track that we got in F1 23 is France. This track's been directly carried over from last year's game, and that's not a bad thing as it's one of the more unusual tracks in the game. It features a range of strange corners and unconventional braking zones. This challenges the driver to adapt their style to fit the track, but it also tests your car's balance, especially the rear stability under braking. Starting with the aero setup, I've set this to 18 for both the front and the rear. For a long time I was running a higher front wing, but I was constantly being challenged by the rear of the car with it stepping out of line when accelerating through the longer corners. For this reason I opted for an even setup, and this really settles the car down through all the corners and provides you with a platform that you can push the car through each corner both on entry and exit. The on-throttle diff has been set to 50% to help manage the rear of the car under acceleration a bit more. This lets you accelerate a bit harder out of some of the turns, which is really important for the corners before long straights such as turn 6, 9 and 15. For the off-throttle diff I've gone with 52%, and this could be set a little lower if you do struggle to turn the car into the slower corners, but I found 52% was just right. I've set the camber to almost full right values both front and back, but I've turned the front camber down to -2.6 and set the rear to -1. I've also increased the front toe to 0.02 to help a little bit to promote a little more responsiveness that went missing by reducing the front aero setup. And finally, I lowered the rear toe right down to 0.1 to eliminate as much drag as possible. Now the suspension setup for Paul Ricard is a little strange. The front suspension is incredibly low for an F1 23 setup, and that's because of the curbs. This track is incredibly flat, which in theory would result in a stiffer front suspension setup. However, the curbs are all raised just enough to cause some instability throughout a race. For this reason, lowering the front suspension to 21 while keeping the rear pretty stiff at 12 just works really well. I've then softened the front ARB right down to just 1, while actually stiffening the rear to 8. This is also very unusual, but works incredibly well to balance the car. Then for the ride height, I've gone with a pretty traditional approach of 35 and 38. For the brake setup, I've gone with 100% brake pressure, much like all of our other car setups. Then I set the front brake bias a bit lower to 54%. There are many braking zones around Paul Ricard where you will be applying some steering lock, so a lower brake bias approach just works really well. Tyre wear around Paul Ricard is heavily biased towards the left of the car. For this reason, I'd recommend setting the front left pressure to 23.1 and the front right to 23.2. Then set the rear left to 20.5 and the rear right to 20.6. The final track in our entire car setup series is Portugal, and boy is this a fun track to end on. This circuit hasn't been on the official calendar since 2021, and that's a huge shame. The track layout with all of the undulation and unique corners provides such an entertaining drive. There are a good number of different corner styles, with fast corners through to much slower turns, and some corners such as turn 4, as well as most of the final sector, combine huge elevation changes with fast corners, making for some really entertaining and thrilling segments. Much like Qatar, this is a circuit I could drive for a long time without getting bored, but I'm going to stop raving on about how enjoyable this track is, and I'm going to jump straight into the car setup. Now for the aero, I've opted for a relatively low downforce approach with 27 at the front and 30 at the rear. This gives your car a huge boost in a straight line, making this actually feel pretty OP compared to the AI. I had to really increase the AI quite substantially while testing this car setup, as I could simply drive straight past them in some areas. The higher rear aero provides much needed rear stability, which is really tested through some of the faster corners such as turn 4. For the transmission, a pretty traditional approach of 52% on throttle and 51% off throttle is the order of the day. This gives good traction and good rotation into the slower corners, making up for the lower front aero setup. I've set the camber far right for both front and back, and then I've really tweaked the toe to emphasise stability. The front toe at 0.02 reduces drag and stops the car from being too twitchy. Then I've really increased the rear to 0.25, and this provides excellent rear stability, and we can get away with the excess drag as the aero setup is on the lower side. The suspension setup for Portimao is much more traditional compared to our previous setup at Paul Ricard, going 19 and 5 on the suspension and 10 and 2 on the anti-roll bars. These values are on the lower side to again help with a little bit of stability. A stiffer approach could cause your car to really misbehave over the big bumps and the elevation changes. Then for the ride height, go with 35 and 39. Now I'm running our normal brake setup of 100% pressure and 55% brake bias, as this provides the most even braking setup. Then, much like Paul Ricard, I've set the tyre pressures individually. The left of the car gets really punished more than the right, and this means that the left tyres wear much faster. We can help combat this a little by setting the front left tyre to 22.5 while keeping the front right at 22.7 psi. Then I've done the same at the rear with a rear left of 20.1 and a rear right of 20.2. And that completes not only our Portugal car setup, but also our complete F123 car setup series. This is the final track in the game, and this setup now means I've created a dry car setup for every single track. For those that have followed these car setups and commented on each one, thank you for your support, and don't worry, this isn't me done with F123. I'll be continuing to release F123 tips and tricks videos along with various other sim racing and F123 content. I'm also planning a wet car setup series, so for those who have asked about the setups, they'll be coming shortly. If all of this content sounds interesting to you and you've liked the previous F123 content, consider subscribing. But for now, really enjoy this setup and I'll see you out on track.